Welcome, everyone. We are so glad that you are here joining us, and I'm really excited to announce our guest. I am here today with Christine Caldwell, and before I read her bio, I just want to share that this is a really beautiful full circle moment for me. Christine and I met back in 1996 when I was 23. Just going to locate that for us for a moment. And I was just starting out in my studies in somatic psychology. And Christine, I would sit in your classes and I would just feel like my mind was on fire with inspiration. Literally every day that I sat with you for 3 years in my initiation into somatic psychology. So it is just such a great honor to spend this time with you and just really celebrate you and the influence you have had on me and this field. Wow. So for our guests, let me tell you a little bit about Christine. Christine is a professor emeritus at the Naropa University Somatic Counseling Psychology Program and the director of the Moving Cycle Institute, and author of 5 books on somatic psychology and really beautiful, influential, integrative books, over 30 book chapters and journal articles in this field. She is both a dance therapist and a body psychologist, specializing in movement-based practices for healing, learning, art making, and self-reflection. And you can all learn more at www.themovingcycle.com. So thank you, Christine, for being here.
You're very welcome. It's really a pleasure, a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to dive us into some questions, and I also trust that our dialogue is going to take us into some enriching places together that we'll just discover through the process. But I want to start out with a conversation about phenomenology and what that has to do with body-centered practices in somatic psychology and how basically self-study guides this process.
Right. Well, it's funny because this all began for me, my dive into phenomenology began for me when a friend and colleague of mine, Sabine Koch, who is a German dance therapist and a professor in Heidelberg, she had taken my training, and at one point someday, just casually, she said, "Christine, you're a phenomenologist." And I actually had to go home and look up the word because I wasn't entirely sure I knew about that branch of philosophy very well. And even after I dove in, I still feel like I don't know a whole lot about it. I think it would take years and years and years for me to really feel like I could really say that I'm a phenomenologist, at least from an academic perspective. But from an experiential perspective, I think Sabina was right. The work that I do is phenomenological. And what that really means on a very simple level is that the direct experience, being in the present moment in one's bodily experience, is phenomenological. That's phenomenology, just on a very simple level. So being in the present moment and studying one's experience in the present moment is really what my work has always been about. And only recently have I said, okay, I'll call myself a phenomenologist of some kind. So
it resonates for me. And I think that the experience, again, that I had sitting with you so many years ago, it was always that. It was always the opportunity, in fact, the invitation to be with myself in the present moment and to just observe what was unfolding. So I love that there's a name that you've given to what it is that you offer to people, perhaps have always offered.
Yeah. Well, and I think you're bringing up an important point, which is that the phenomenological experience is there for both the client and the therapist, so that the when I teach therapeutic skills, I'm really teaching the therapist to also use their present moment experience and that what's happening in the room as the grist for how the work should unfold. And so I'm not particularly interested in things like diagnostic categories or deep psychological states that have been named by a lot of old dead white guys and all of that, right? We just sit together in this space, in this time, and we allow our bodies, what I call our bodily authority, the authority of our own lived experience to really navigate the session. And so the session unfolds sort of in a way in which you don't know what's going to happen next. And I find this to be very, it's a little nerve-wracking for people when they first start to learn it because it's hard to trust. It's kind of like letting go of a reference point when you're in deep water. And so it takes a while to learn to just trust that what's arising between you in the engagement between you is where you need to go.
Yeah. And such a trust in the unknown and the willingness to temporarily suspend, or even more than temporarily, but to suspend what you think is going to happen to then be able to be present with what's actually here.
Yes, exactly. That's a beautiful way to put it. And a way that I also talk about it is that it's so important to postpone meaning making. And so you don't try to analyze what's happening or explain what's happening or contextualize what's happening in terms of past, but you just stay with an almost contemplative process of allowing the body, what I call the body narrative, the body's narratives, the body's stories, to emerge and be supported in a way that they become more coherent and that the healing potential of just telling the body's story through breath, sensation, movement, etc., will be the healing force.
Beautiful. I don't know exactly when this was. It might have been just a few years ago. I was attending a book signing of yours on your work, Body Fullness.
Yeah.
And you shared at that event, you were reading about the kind of sensory motor loop. And one thing that you said that really touched me, and I'd love to invite you to expand on it, was that if we are overweighted in one side of that equation of sensing or moving, it can take us out of balance. And yeah, maybe I'll just turn it over to you there and hear what you have to say on that.
Yeah, this really stood out for me as a critical issue when I started to study neuroscience, like about, 25 years ago or something, 30 years ago, because you can very plainly see from both the structure and function of the body that if you arbitrarily start with sensation, that a sensory neuron goes toward the central nervous system and it is either processed very simply into a motoric action like a reflex, like a knee-jerk reflex, or it goes up into various structures of the brain where interneurons, they're called, neurons between the sensory and the motor, really complexified, but always structure you towards some kind of responsive action. So the short idea there is that a sensory neuron is always sooner or later hooked up to a motor neuron. And the motor neuron then informs the next sensation. And so we are a sensory motor loop, and that getting behind that idea is, for me, one of the primary ways in which we can understand our work and really structure our work. And so this is why I start to talk about when we pay more attention or devote more energy to one over the other, we can imbalance. So the balance is that sensation wants to and does turn into action. Actions generate new sensations, and then that goes forward. But if we're very, very smitten with sensation, let's say, then we're going, now I'm feeling this, now I'm feeling that, now I'm feeling this, now I'm feeling that, now. And what happens is you get so alert to what's happening without having a sense of what you might want to do in response to that, that it actually can create a kind of anxious over-vigilance towards what you're feeling. And again, a reduction in your sense of bodily authority about that you are in charge of what you do about that sensation. And so it just feeling something isn't enough. There's that quality of how do I then want to shape myself in the world responsively as a result of what I feel. And that's what, to me, generates this sense of bodily authority, that my experience goes into an action that helps me take care of myself, helps me feel safe, helps me feel well, helps me feel happy. And even if something very difficult or challenging or even traumatic is happening, I still feel that I am in the experience, and that being in the experience, and I like to give a kind of a canoeing metaphor, that I keep my paddle in the water. Even if something really difficult is happening, that I keep my paddle in the water, and that is a kind of vaccination against trauma being long-lasting.
It's a powerful metaphor, Christine, especially because, as I think you know, my husband and I, Bruce and I, have spent a lot of time in boats on the water, both canoes and kayaks, and especially when you get pulled into a current, that current can start to take you. And if you have your paddle in the water, if you're actually moving in relationship to the moving water, you can control your boat. And without that, it will take you wherever the water is going. And it's just a profound metaphor. Thank you for that.
Yeah. And my husband and I also canoe in whitewater. We're both local, and we are, very familiar with Colorado rivers. And it's true, even if you're both paddling and doing all the right things, you sometimes still take a swim, right?
Yeah.
But when your paddle is in the water and you're working with the circumstances of the river or the circumstances of your phenomenological experience, then you have a sense, even if you've gone, even if you fall over and go for a swim, that there was something meaningful about it. There was something that you learned from it. It could have even be something you can laugh about afterwards, etc. So I think it's a very useful metaphor, and I appreciate that we both physically have a sense of that, what that metaphor means.
Yeah, I think so too. I'm also reflecting on how, that experience of agency, as you're describing it, in the process of what's happening. I had worked with someone. We had a series of flooding events that occurred here in our local community back in 2013, and I had worked with someone who had gotten buried in a mudslide up in 4 Mile Canyon, right? And yet the experience that she had of actually being able to ultimately mobilize and help dig herself out. And even though there were broken bones and there was so much that occurred there, that agency,
yes,
was profoundly protective right? Like the ability to get up and climb up out of this situation. And I think it's the experience of what sometimes we call a freeze response, but that, as you're saying, there's all of the sensory input and there's very blocked motoric output. There's very little ability to move in relationship to it.
An excellent example of that. And, I think you and I both are very interested in studying those kinds of movement responses to traumatic events. And there's, as we know, there's immobilization response and mobilization responses. Like mobilizing is fight and flee, and immobilization is freeze and faint. And neither of them, none of them are any better or worse than the other, but that sense of agency comes from, I'm going to consciously freeze right now because that's the most adaptive thing. I'm going to consciously fight to get up to the top of this mudslide because that's the most adaptive thing. And so that idea that my bodily resources are actively engaged is what both of us know is one of those powerful moments in trauma work.
Yeah, I think you refer to this as some kind of mobility gradient, but I was wondering if you could expand on what that is.
Yeah. So in fact, over the last few years, my teaching about the mobility gradient has gotten more and more centralized. I'm more and more realizing that it feels very foundational to what we're doing. And I actually borrowed it, or you could even say I stole it from biology. I have a dear friend who's a wildlife biologist, Mark Bekoff, and he introduced me to this idea that biologists have this concept of a mobility gradient. And it's the idea that on an organism level, like let's say a wolf or a cat or something, that you have very small internal, tiny, and automatic movements going on, like breathing, like heart rate, like cellular processes. And then you start, when you travel along the mobility gradient, you start to get a little bit more visible and a little bit more under control of what's happening. So down here are things like reflexes and autonomic actions that are all about our aliveness. And then, next up, you get what are called motor plans. And these are genetically programmed for us to want to learn. And so for fish, it's swimming. For birds, it's flying. For humans, it's walking. And so this longing to be upright and this longing to work our legs and our arms in this back and forth motion is a motor plan. And then we come then up into attunement movement. And I'll kind of whip through this because I'm sure we've got plenty of stuff to talk about. And then nonverbal communication movement. And then at the far end of the mobility gradient, we get spontaneous, more creative, open movement that adapts at a moment's notice to just, where do I want to go now? What wants to happen next? I don't know where I'm going, but this is kind of fun and I'm just going for it, right? So this mobility gradient is, for me, part of how I work with clients so that I watch for how both of our bodies are navigating the mobility gradient. So there's nothing wrong with being in any one place in the mobility gradient. We actually need all of those locations. In fact, the autonomic movements have to be present in order to support more voluntary movements. So for instance, a lot of our voluntary movement is actually based on reflexes, which is why we learn those first as even fetuses and neonates and all that. So the issue then in a session is to look at what someone like Stephen Porges might call dissolutions. And so what I've started to notice is that when one comes into trauma responses or also into addictive states, that the ability to hang out in this more free, spontaneous, playful part of the mobility gradient diminishes. And so your movement becomes more stereotyped, more predictable, and more simplistic. And so that can be a good thing. Like when you're riding your bike, you kind of want it to be real simple and you want that motor plan to just kick in. And that's very cool. So it's not that it's wrong, but what happens is that we limit our range on the mobility gradient. And so a lot of the work then is to, instead of that kind of old dance therapy notion that, if you're kind of contracted, then the dance therapy is to make you bigger, right? You don't go into opposing what's happening. You actually start to investigate it the way it is. And so you investigate the motor plan of, let's say, wanting to push or wanting to grasp or wanting to shy away or feeling like your eyes just keep blinking all the time or that your swallowing has changed. So instead of trying to make that go away, because sometimes it's unpleasant, we actually go into that experience. And this is actually another way that I understand phenomenology, which is from a philosopher named Elizabeth Benke. And she talked about, go figure, she talked about micromovements, and I didn't even know she existed when I started talking about micromovements. And so this idea, though, is that instead of seeing what's emerging in your body, wherever that is on the mobility gradient, instead of seeing that as problematic, you see it as information. And you, in what she calls it, inhabiting it from within. I love that phrase. So she talks about inhabiting that movement, even if it's an automatic reflexive movement that you're not in charge of. You inhabit the movement from within as if you had control over it. And by doing that, you phenomenologically study it and find what your body is actually wanting to do with that, what your body's trying to do to heal itself, to find a new metabolic set point, to remember something, to express something. So that's kind of a big overview of the mobility gradient and why I think it's cool and groovy.
I think it's cool and groovy too. The other thing that I hear as you describe this, Christine, is that it's very kind, right? When you say it's not an intention to go to make something else happen, you're actually going to meet someone right where they are and turn toward it, and it feels so nonviolent.
Yeah.
I actually was wondering if you might even speak a little bit to that, what I might call kind of like spiritual ground of the work that lives in that approach.
Yeah. Thank you, because I do believe that one of the things we have to do is to really study the therapeutic relationship and examine it through this lens of nonviolence. And so what I would also say is it's an issue of social justice as well. And it's an issue of inclusion. And it's an issue of diversity, that you sit with a client and you allow the authority of their body to be supported, their bodily knowing, and that their experience is legitimate. And so first, they have to feel that in their own experience, that this, whatever, how uncomfortable it is, how ugly it might seem to me, this movement or this posture or this state, that there's something very important about my own bodily authority that's trying to organize, that's trying to emerge. And so any way that the two of us, or in a group more than two of us, any way that the two of us can really greet and welcome that, I think is an act of social activism, actually. And so that's a lot of where I go with it, in terms of what I can do to help the larger context, the social context, and perhaps even a transpersonal context to emerge. So I don't often feel that I can use the lens of spirituality in a very competent way, but this way that I understand bodily authority and the oppression of the body, that takes away bodily authority, whether it's through small acts of ongoing diminishment or large violent acts. It's got that same feeling of my body is not mine. My body is inhabited or possessed by the state, right? The state has control of my body. The state tells me what I can do with my body or whatever, or not, or my family or my religion or my social environment really can oppress my bodily authority. And so that's kind of my 2 cents about why bodily authority is so important and why not making my experience wrong is very important, and not trying to immediately, it's hard, but not trying to immediately relieve symptoms. That's sort of the clinical way that we can look at it, is you don't try to relieve symptoms. You have to be able to have control over exiting them when you need to, because you won't be able to enter a system well and safely until you know you can exit the symptom. But the goal is to be able to investigate the symptom and to really inhabit it from within, to really use it as its own source of bodily authority. And that way we prevent ourselves from being colonized by social systems and people who would rob us of our bodily authority.
This profound language that you're using in here, and it just feels like such a restoration of dignity and respect for the inherent wisdom that lives inside of every person, that they know their own, even if they don't know here, right? That there is an inherent wisdom in here that will guide that unfolding.
Beautifully put, succinctly put. Not my strong suit sometimes, to be succinct.
Something I love about you, actually. So you go for it. You mentioned the term micro movements. I'd love for you to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, this comes from the fact that I kind of was brought up back in the day in the late 60s and early 70s. I'm in my 70s now. And so I was, I was in Southern California when all the 60s and 70s hit. So I feel very strongly influenced by that time and that place and the people that were around me at that point. And at that point, both dance therapy and body psychology were, of course, younger as fields. And there was a kind of value system that wasn't spoken about real consciously that more is better. And so if you're feeling angry, then feeling more angry would be better. That's sort of cathartic model, right? And in dance therapy, if this was emotion that was coming up, doing it bigger and more and getting it through the whole body was better. And so there's this quality of making things more large, exaggerated, moving through the whole body, which makes them much more visible, and also much more shaped for social use. So how I appear, how I agree with the therapist that this is a fun movement, because the therapist is doing it, or because the therapist is encouraging me to get angrier or sadder or whatever. So that is the context under which I was getting my PhD, and my internship was at an addictions recovery center here in town. And so I would see people right after they got out of detox. And what I was noticing was that there was these moments where they would start to feel something, and they would start to get a look on their face, or their breathing would change, or I could tell that a feeling was coming, or a shift in their experience was coming. And then they would go, they would take it away, and their body would take it away. And their body would take it away primarily through little micro movements. Sometimes they would be gestures, but a lot of times you just see this little kind of, the chest going down, and then the chin going in. And so I got really interested in these movements that would show up very stereotypically. There's your mobility gradient again, but very predictably when a person wanted to avoid their direct experience, their phenomenological experience. And so I actually started to work with them to say, I noticed that your chest just went down a little bit as you talked about your what that night you got arrested. And so would it be okay to just pay attention to this? Let's trust this a little bit and just see what wants to happen. And so we would just allow the chest to go down a little bit and just study that experience. And so then it would go down a little bit more, and then it seems to want to go here, and then all of a sudden it would start to rotate, and then the hands would come up, and then I'm making this up, by the way. And then they would come forward, and the head would go back, and all of a sudden the body's starting to tell a story of something that it's holding and that it needs to talk about and hasn't been able to or allowed to talk about. And so this was a huge, huge kind of development in my work, that I began to see these small micro movements as the leading edge of what Freud might have called the unconscious, but certainly buried material that the more socially engaged body isn't tracking and isn't supporting. And so I found that I could do much deeper work, much more efficiently and quickly, by actually going for these tiny little movements in the body that are, again, probably down on this more autonomic part of the mobility gradient, because they were the leading edge of the material that actually needed to be worked with. So that's kind of where it all got started. And certainly there are others, I think, who either naturally talk about micro movements or just tend to be good at that without even knowing what they're doing, even consciously. But there's also been a lot of research in this area. So Paul Ekman's work with facial coding and all these other actual scientists and biologists who are studying non-human animals are looking at this idea as well.
It's really striking to me, and what I hear in your story here, Christine, is that there's this quality of like really deep attunement to the other person, and the willingness to lean in and share what it is that you see. Do you ever find that in that process of being so deeply seen that it evokes a quality of shame or embarrassment?
Absolutely. Absolutely. A lot of times these micro movements are held in, are capped by shame. And so it takes a while to demonstrate and live into a kind of welcoming and curiosity about them that is hopefully over time infectious, and that the client can internalize and say, oh, yeah, you know, I agree. I feel like this seems to want to go down. I remember a woman who came in, wanted to quit smoking. And she had this wonderful gesture where I'll have to take my glasses off. She was starting to talk about something that was a little emotional for her. Her face started to appear sad. I didn't know if she was sad, but her face appeared sad. And she started to do this, and then she just went, yeah, well, that happened. What else can we talk about? And I said, oh, wow, I noticed that you did this action. You just describe it. You don't explain it. You don't make meaning out of it. You don't do anything. You don't put any spin on it. And so I just said, oh, I noticed you did this movement. She said, no, I didn't. And I went, oh, okay. Yeah, sure. No problem. Left that. And of course, the next session, she came in a couple of weeks and she said, oh my God, I do it all the time. And so she was able to realize that she was doing it, and that when we did it on purpose, the movement became this and then this. And then it became this just powerful grief over her mother's death that she was actually punished for feeling as a child. And so this is the kind of thing where you have to be very, very sensitive. You have to take your time. You have to respect their people's boundaries about this, and to not fall into the shame experience with them. So this is a case where you want to actually misattune deliberately as a way to not fall into that shame pit.
That's right there. That is just so profound, right? To recognize that your attunement is itself a profound, I don't know if tool is the right word, but intervention, exchange, and that just as much as we can offer and apply it, that sometimes what's necessary is to withdraw it as a deep respect and for the dignity of the other.
Beautifully put. Very well put. Another thing that I'll tell my students is your body is an intervention. Just you sitting there is an intervention. There's no getting around it. There's no Freud actually tried to deal with it. He tried to put the analyst behind the client on the couch so they couldn't see any of that stuff. That's that it's kind of an interesting way to do it. Yes, then there's all the psychodynamic hoo-ha that goes along with that. But what I would like to do is actually be in the relationship with them, and so that they can feel when they are also able to do something on their own, from their own choices. And also that I don't get enabling, or that I over intervene with my body, so that I'm sort of taking care of them rather than helping them experience something that is emergent. And so it's actually a very complex thing. And it shows that, at least for me, learning how to do therapy cannot be manualized. It can't be, if they do this, you do this, because it's all that training is about really finding my own bodily experience and not taking it literally, not using it as a way to analyze the client, which a lot of people do, but using it as a way to be in the experience with the client, and then to step back from the experience so the client can reestablish their own feeling of, I've got this.
It's beautiful. I have another question for you, and I sense that it's related here. But you speak about the process of leveraging natural oscillations in the body as
Yeah.
as a template for change. Let's say more about that.
Yeah. So the body is always oscillating, just like a heartbeat, our breath, our digestion, peristalsis in the body. The body's actually full of oscillations that are governed by the autonomic nervous system. And so luckily, we don't have to do them consciously. They operate automatically. But there's also a lot of different larger oscillations. There's social oscillations as well. So there's, waking and sleeping. There's the rhythm of getting close to someone and getting more separate from them. There's all kinds of oscillations. And what my work really is about, largely speaking, is instead of trying to change an oscillation, like you said, leverage the oscillation or occupy the oscillation consciously so that it can direct the body to reset different metabolic and or expressive actions, so in ways that promote well-being. And so I feel like the most primary oscillation that I use as a therapist is what I call the oscillation of attention. And so not only do our heart and lungs and other parts of our body oscillate, but the brain actually oscillates as well. And one of the ways in which we oscillate in the brain, there are many oscillations in the brain, but one of the things we do is we oscillate our attention. And our attention naturally oscillates from inside. We check out, like right now, my throat is a little dry, and I notice my fingers against my chest. And then I oscillate out and I see you and your lovely blue sweater and your big smile. And I just remember all those years we've known each other. And so my oscillation goes out there. And so it's not that I have to be 50-50. And in fact, it's very important sometimes to be really strongly internal or really strongly external with my attention. But what is important is that I feel that I have the ability to move my attention where it needs to go. So a lot of what we understand as attention deficit disorder, for instance, or hyperactivity disorder, is that your attention gets sucked into something either outside you or inside you, and it can't detach from that. And so this is how we understand, for instance, obsession. Obsession is really when your attention gets stuck on something and it can't disengage and go somewhere else, or it can't stay engaged. it gets distracted by any little old thing. And so to me, disturbances in the oscillation of attention are actually foundational for mental illness and mental health, what we call mental illness and mental health, is when you have dysfunctional oscillations in attention. Those are what we often do diagnostically as in a way to talk about what we call mental illness is. So to me, leveraging oscillations is leveraging things like paying attention to my breathing, which of course everybody does, right? Movement educators, movement therapists, body psychotherapists, everybody. Dance therapists need to do it a little bit more, but really, really allowing breath to support you in what you're experiencing. And so the leveraging of different sensory oscillations, so focusing, let's say, outside with my eyes or inside with my interoception, that's a sensory oscillation. There's movement oscillations also, and of course, breath oscillations. And so when I talk about staying associated rather than dissociation, I talk about staying associated. It's with this triangle of breathing, moving, and sensing. And there's an oscillation between those three, and each one of those in turn has its own oscillations that I work with very consciously to help clients stay associated. In other words, to stay here and now, and in their direct experience, in their phenomenological experience, rather than exiting and going into what's more commonly called dissociative states.
I'm going to just share what has occurred for me across these last 45 minutes or so in sitting with you, is that there was a shift about 5 minutes ago as you were speaking where I suddenly felt myself reside more deeply inside, kind of behind my own eyes, in a way that felt so deeply restorative, like, oh, I landed. And obviously I come in and out, as we all do, from that residing so deeply, and of course being more outwardly attended, as you're naming, that I experienced that, and perhaps have always really benefited from the connection I feel with you, is this gift of the opportunity to arrive in or reside in a very safe manner. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you for saying that. Thank you. And I think it's not very common or chic to say that you're proud of someone, but I am so proud of you. Maybe it's a little self-centered to say that, but I just feel so grateful that you and I have known each other, that I had the opportunity to be a teacher to you way back when, and watch you become this master therapist that is having an effect really in the world, globally. So I'm very grateful.
Now I think I'm blushing quite a bit.
A lovely autonomic response.
I often reference a very specific moment of you handing me a baton, a very important baton, which was the invitation to teach the neuroscience of the body-mind connection class. And it started a whole journey. And so thank you for that gift.
Well, thank you for taking the baton, because that's not an easy one to hold on to and do it well. And I know you do it so well. So.
Well, thank you. So before we close out today, is there anything else that you want to share about your projects or your books or your teachings? What's front and center for you right now?
Well, I'm just putting the finishing touches on my fifth book, which is called Conscious Moving. And that's been my latest baby. And I've really enjoyed writing it because I actually wanted to get out of the track of just talking about healing and therapy, because what I was realizing is a lot of what I'm working with is equally applicable to art making, to creativity, to learning, to how people in educational circumstances can learn well, also to contemplative practice. So I wanted to write a book that really got much more inclusive about how to use movement consciously. And so that's the baby that's getting the finishing touches. She'll be out in, I think, June or something. So that's been a big project. And I think also I feel I'm asking myself, do I have anything else I want to say, to the world? And it's interesting that I feel that I might not have much more to say. And who knows, that might, go out the window tomorrow. But what I feel is related to that is this sense of empowering people like you to move the field forward and to make room for the next powerful generations to really take their seat. And so I think that's what I might want to talk about going forward. I think it's a natural process that I'm studying.
So beautiful and so inspiring and encouraging all around. And that it really is what I hope that our listeners, that you will take away from this talk as well, is that it's not about hearing what other great people are doing, although of course that is amazing and inspiring, but it's also about how do we then bring this into action, as you, Christine, really share so much of your deep value of action and social responsibility, that when we feel something, when we are gifted with that experience of the transformational power of somatic and embodiment and an awareness, then there is the next task, which is how we move that into the world. So thank you so much for inspiring us. Any final words from you before we close?
Oh gosh, no! It's been an honor to do this with you, and a great example of how this baton is keeping passing. So thank you very much, Arielle, particularly for your articulateness. It's really stunning to be in the presence of you. So thank you.
Very mutual. And to our listeners, thank you all for listening to this amazing session with Christine Caldwell, and grateful to have had this opportunity. Until next time.